Thanks everybody for being here, and especially given a relatively early morning hour. We've been trying to find times for these that work for different groups of people, and there were some people for whom this was the best time, so wanted to make sure that we could accommodate people who had scheduling conflicts at different times during the day. So I'm Nathan Urban. I'm the still relatively new provost here at Lehigh. This is the second in a series of these faculty town hall or events. I wanted to just spend a few minutes both talking about how I see the purpose of these in general, and then talking a little bit about what the plan is for this one, which is what's a little bit different in terms of the structure that we're trying to achieve. We're trying to make sure that there's ample opportunity for faculty to provide their thoughts and their input on a variety of different topics. So in general, why am I doing these faculty town halls? It has to do with the fact that I have arrived here at Lehigh in a rather unusual time, I guess everyone would say, in that given the difficulty or absence of most in-person events, there are fewer opportunities for chance encounters, fewer opportunities to run into people, have a 5-minute, 10-minute conversation at a reception while standing in line to get coffee or whatever it is. And so I've been looking for more ways to connect with and learn about Lehigh through the faculty. And so this is one of these opportunities. I'm also doing what are effectively sort of open office hours. I did one last week. There's one coming up either later this week or next. Those are also an opportunity to hear from faculty about particular issues, very unstructured, sort of informal kind of way. So if you have other thoughts or ideas about ways in which I might be able to achieve some of these same kinds of goals, I'm very interested and open to hearing them, because I think that, for me, one of the most challenging and oddest, really, aspects of taking on this role at this particular time is the disconnection from personal contact and personal interaction with people at the university. To some extent, that certainly applies with respect to faculty and also students and staff. There's a small group of people that I interact with a lot because of the issues at hand, but the sort of breadth of interaction is something that I'm trying to expand through these different mechanisms, structures, fora. So the topic for today that I wanted to raise and really hopefully generate a conversation that will start here, but one that will continue. We've talked about framing it in a couple different ways. The way that we settled on is what makes Lehigh Lehigh, which is sort of a bit of an odd framing, but let me say a little bit about what my thought is and what I mean by that. So every university, every organization, every institution has certain things that make it distinctive, that differentiate it from others, but also make it what it is, make it the people who are associated with it unique and distinctive, and having certain kinds of characteristics. In the same way that an MIT grad is different from a Harvey Mudd grad, is different from a Amherst grad. There are aspects of the institution that that reflect both the history of the institution, the current priorities, the people who are there. And I have a sense of what this is like, or what is true for Lehigh in this way, but I don't want to decide that I have a clear enough sense at this point. So I'm really interested in getting feedback and getting people's thoughts about that. I think I've thought about this in terms of what makes Lehigh distinctive, whether that's with respect to students or with respect to research or with respect to the culture of the place. I've thought about it in terms of what has Lehigh done particularly well in the past? What are some of its, if you will, legacies? That could be built on, and that might be things that would then connect with important elements of the future of the university, and that understanding that continuity, I think, is something that's important. We settled on sort of what makes Lehigh Lehigh, in part because hopefully it's not just about what differentiates Lehigh from other places. I don't want to sort of overly focus on that. You know, Lehigh is not Lafayette because, or Lehigh is not RPI because. I want to sort of try to keep it focused on what makes Lehigh itself, what makes Lehigh Lehigh. Throughout the conversation, there will be some opportunities for feedback, and one of the things that I think it's useful or important to think about, at least from my perspective, is that if there's a thought that you have about what makes Lehigh distinctive or what makes Lehigh Lehigh, if it relates to the students or to the faculty or to the research or to the sort of, culture of the place, I would ask you to think about how do you know that, or what's some indication of that, what's some, if you will, evidence of that's true. That would be really helpful for me in terms of understanding not just the statement or the claim, but where we can go to look for, to develop a better understanding of why that is, and what specifically you might mean in that context. Because I think this is not always it's kind of a slippery concept at times, what makes a university or any institution distinctive in this way. So that's important certainly for me to understand. It may be completely obvious to you. I've heard things, statements like Lehigh is or Lehigh students or Lehigh faculty are sort of have a blue collarness to them, sort of a willingness to roll up sleeves and get things done and sort of work hard. And I may, in response to that, I may ask, so what are some examples, or how do we know, or things like that? Because I think it is important for me to have some of those concrete examples of that. So that's going to be the way the conversation is going to run. And let me just say a few things about why I think this is important to do, and why I think it's important for us to understand, for me to understand, and for us collectively to have an understanding of. I think this is a time in higher education when there are different roles that different institutions are playing. There are different sort of kinds of institutions, and institutions have a certain identity. And that identity is important for, certainly it's important for recruiting students and recruiting faculty, to be able to articulate to students or to parents what it would be like to be here. What would the student gain? What would their experience be like? What would this experience prepare them for going forward? I think that's something that's important that we be able to articulate to students. It's also, in my mind, important for thinking about decision making, thinking about the priorities that we have as an institution, things that we want to expand on, want to do well, want to connect with each other here at the university. I think that in many respects, it's easier to, if you can identify some of those areas where we have particular strengths, or where there's a history, or where there's a difference at Lehigh, those might be things that we want to look at to prioritize going forward. And so that is something that I'm certainly thinking about. I think it's also important that we have this sense and be able to articulate this sort of the story of Lehigh. So as we connect with Lehigh, as we connect with others outside the university, to help them understand what it is that's special about this place. I think it's very useful and important to have that sort of succinct set of statements about what it is that makes Lehigh distinctive, makes Lehigh unique. And I think that this relates to, when we tell those kinds of stories, it relates to an earlier point that I made, that we want to be able to tell those stories and then provide examples, to provide some concrete descriptions of some of the proof that these things that we're saying are true, or that there's evidence for them. So with that, the way that this is going to work is that, so the three deputy provosts, Beth, Dolan, Jennifer Jensen, Jackie Krasas, are going to pose some questions. And there were some questions, and thanks to those of you who provided feedback already through the RSVP response. And we'll compile those, we have compiled those, and we'll use that as the basis for some of the discussion today. But also we're going to have the deputy provost sort of pose some of those questions and sort of initiate some of the discussion. I really hope that this is really very interactive. I'm going to, for parts of it, sit back and listen. Towards the end, I may try and do some summarizing of the things that I think I heard. But we'll see how this goes. So I'm really encouraging everybody to try and provide feedback and to speak up and let me know, to initiate some discussion. Okay, I think I know. I think the way this is going to run is that Jennifer Jensen, you're going to start off. So Jennifer, floor is yours.
Thank you. Jackie, Beth, and I spent some time going over the questions. I don't know that any of these is verbatim from questions that were asked, but they build on and draw from many of the questions that you did put forward. And we've lumped them into sort of two categories. The first deals with education and the curriculum, and the second deals with research and the intellectual footprint. So we each have a question within one of those areas. So I'll start with the first question. This is really then to open it up for to the floor, to anyone to answer, and try to give Nathan an idea and then start the back and forth on this one. The first question is, if I wanted to know what it means when a recent undergrad says, I'm a Lehigh grad, what do we need to do in the curriculum, elsewhere? How would students benefit? What might they lose? And what might faculty gain or lose? What would it take to say, I'm a recent Lehigh grad, to know what that means?
Looks like Frank has his hand up.
I'm sorry, should I just hop in or?
Go for it.
Yeah.
If it gets busy, we'll ask for raised hands. I'm sorry, I didn't see that.
Okay. The provost asked for context. So I teach 200, 400 students a semester. And the dean has given me a budget to take 6 or 8 students to lunch each week so I can get a chance to actually talk to them. If they're first year students, I ask why Lehigh. And if they're second, third, or fourth year students, I ask them to describe their experience. 3 things come up. And Jennifer, one of them really doesn't fit within your categories. The 3 things that come up is that, first of all, they like Lehigh because it's academically challenging. They're learning things they never learned before. The second thing that comes up at the time is that they're working harder than they've ever worked in their lives, that this is something that's expected. The third is that they thought it was a good thing that Lehigh had a strong, what do you want to call it, a social, athletic, a non-academic component. And those 3 things come up all the time. The academics are great, they got to work hard, and they really like the fact that there's a social and athletic life. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Other thoughts on this? Agreement, disagreement? I know it's 8:15.
I can just jump in and say.
Actually, I think Susan has a hand. Nope, never mind.
Sorry.
That was my hand hovering over Susan's.
Oh, I can jump in just to give a thought about, I'm thinking about my alma mater, Davidson College, and there's a feeling about Davidson students that we are, or alums, are people who go into service type jobs. That there's a priority at the institution based on what are you going to do with what you've been given? What are you going to do for this world? And that's a real connecting thread. So there are a lot of ministers, a lot of teachers, a lot of doctors, et cetera. It doesn't mean there aren't bankers and lawyers and folks too, entrepreneurs, but there's still a feeling of what are you giving back? And that's kind of a theme at Davidson. And so I think we're wondering, what is that at Lehigh?
And okay, so there's the follow-up. If you're thinking there isn't one, what does that mean? What does that say about us? Should we have that? I think one of the themes we were building on is that we got it. I think this comes across in a few different ways. Questions about there are too many silos. Everything is very, sort of focused toward college X. College X might be the college that the faculty member was or was not in. What does that? What does that mean for us, and what are the implications there?
Boy, it's quiet.
Jody has her hand up.
Yeah, Jody.
Hi. So to be completely candid, yes, there are tremendous silos. I think it would be more productive to talk about what we want Lehigh students to be, right? Because my sense as a faculty member who's been here for 5.5 years, I could name things like focused on Wall Street, tending towards engineering and business. And of course, that points to the exact kind of responses you're mentioning. Oh, it seems like things are focused on this. But my big takeaway, honestly, would be conservative with a small c, right? That my sense of the institution is one where the Board of Trustees and alumni traditions run very strong. And so my sense of the institution involves, honestly, hesitancy to change what Lehigh students are, right? We could have, Oberlin students who are really into social justice. We could have, lots of schools have that kind of brand. But right now, the brand I sense is focused on people who make things, right? And there's not as much of a focus on students who are questioning for the sake of questioning, for the sake of exploration. And certainly my undergraduates tell me there's a focus on either, like I just had this conversation with an undergrad, that there tends to be a focus socially on sports and Greeks, right? And so that's the current brand as I see it. I think it would be more interesting to talk about what we want Lehigh to be.
Thoughts about that, either about the current or the desired future? William?
Bill has his hand up.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm William Crow. I'm the director of the Lehigh University Art Galleries and professor of practice in art, architecture, and design. I just jotted down a few thoughts, and apologies in advance. I've only had half a cup of coffee, so hopefully this makes sense. But maybe to kind of marry a couple of things that Jody was saying and what others were saying. I'm still relatively new at Lehigh. I've been here just over 2 years. And so there's a few things that I'm noticing maybe on both of those fronts, both in like glimpses of things that I see in current Lehigh students, but also in an attempt to really understand the DNA of Lehigh. There's a few things that really seem to persist, and a couple of them have already been mentioned. One is I really see a desire for Lehigh to be a place for makers and creators. And that seems to very much be in the DNA of the Lehigh Valley with Bethlehem Steel and Asa Packer and the founder, of course. I feel like there's definitely a strong streak of students wanting to know what the application of theory is. So there's a certain amount of pragmatism, a marriage of theory and practice, a lot of students that ask like, for what or to what ends. I think that's very much something that I see in students. Earlier, we talked a little bit about students having a kind of quote unquote blue collarness. I think another way to frame that might be grit, both in terms of kind of psychological grit, in terms of persistence, but frankly also in terms of kind of a certain willingness to get dirty, like to do things that are messy or, roll up one's sleeves. And then another piece, or a couple of other pieces that maybe are at first glance not very academic or maybe responding to the questions that were posed. But I do think that they are ones that we should look at very closely, which is a Lehigh student's choice to be where we are geographically. So thinking about our geographic advantage of being very close to two major urban centers, New York and Philadelphia, and also our geographic location that makes us unique in terms of being on a mountain. I came from Manhattan and was at NYU before this teaching, and a lot of urban campuses talk about being a vertical campus in terms of skyscrapers. I think there are lots of things that we could capture in terms of a Lehigh student's imagination by being on a mountain. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, William.
Steve had his hand up.
Yeah, I think it appears to me, based on what I am listening to, sometimes if we focus more on the disciplines, like there was a comment about lawyer and there's a discussion on the chat about lawyers and stuff like that. I think as a multidisciplinary institution, we should be focused on higher level of abstractions. For example, if we start off by discussing whatever discipline you could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could be a nurse. We are focusing on the creating a positive impact on the society. That should be at a much higher level of abstraction. And then we can differ in how we are going to achieve that. And in the process, for example, I think one of the things that I have listened to people is that some of the Lehigh people, whether it's students or faculty, we are able to fight at a much different weight class than our own. We are able to take on larger challenges than our ranking will indicate, or our name will indicate, our branding will indicate. So those are the kind of things I think we should look for, where irrespective of whether you are a chemist or a lawyer or a marketing person as I am, we will all be able to make an impact. I think we should strive for that higher level of abstraction instead of getting lost into whether lawyering is good, or engineering is good, or business is good.
Frank Gunter, is your hand up, or was that from before?
My hand is up.
Okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay. I was just looking at the comment that the provost made on the chat, and Ken Sinclair used to be, or retired now, professor of accounting. He was asked about whether Lehigh's intention was to provide the best prepared accountants upon graduation. And he said, absolutely not. He said, that is not our goal. He said that our accountant graduates will not be the best prepared on the first day when they start work. He said, but 10 years after they start work, they're going to be the manager that all the other accountants are going to be working for. That he saw that Lehigh's goal, at least in the business college, should be not getting good jobs, but ensuring that our graduates, our men and women, are leaders in whatever profession they go into. Maybe that's our goal, is to produce leaders. Thank
you. What do people think of that idea? Because I've heard sort of a variety of different viewpoints on this question of the degree to which Lehigh grads are typically, obviously there are exceptions in both directions, but typically leaders.
Also, I think there is when we talk about leadership also, many times a good leader also has to be a good follower for certain cases. Sometimes we create change, sometimes we adapt to change. So sometimes we tend to compartmentalize this too strictly for our own downfall.
Great. So we have a number of questions. This was a sort of a great initial discussion, but I think we're going to move on to, I can't remember, Beth, are you next, or is Jackie? Jackie's next.
Actually, I'm going to go next, because the question I have really follows off the heels of what Bill was talking about. So you'll actually see in here where we quoted you a little bit, Bill. I'm sure this was you, because you used the term DNA when you spoke just before. So we have a history of pragmatism, connecting theory to practice, and experiential education that some identify as connected to our history of strength in engineering and business. How do we all draw upon these traits in our DNA as a place for makers and doers? Many comments that we got reflected that in some areas like the humanities, they're under-recognized in this regard. How can we rectify this?
So I'm going to sort of repose the last bit of that. So especially for those in the humanities or who work with people, closely with people in the humanities, should there be a Lehigh specific, a Lehigh version of the humanities in some sense? And is there already? Jody, you can talk again. That's okay.
Hartley has his hand raised.
Okay. Hartley?
Well, just as an initial thought about this question, there's already a really strong humanities at Lehigh, but because of the legacy of the maker-doer legacy, the business STEM brand, that probably becomes has a certain inertia to it because it's part of how Lehigh then is understood in the broader community. It's how it's marketed by recruitment. The humanities become less visible as something that's already successful at the college. And then it's less supported, it's less well understood. But in fact, functions here really well. So the humanities are in a sense, the low-hanging fruit for how Lehigh could better reimagine itself as a comprehensive undergraduate and research university that's productive, both on the curricular side and in the research side, in all of the fields, but including in the humanities, where there are tremendous untapped resources and opportunities for students that aren't well communicated in the recruitment process, and I think are still not well understood, and students don't have an opportunity to take advantage of them in the ways that I think they should.
Jody, did you want to jump back in?
Sure. I would just add to everything Hartley said that aside from branding, students don't think of coming here for the humanities. We have exceptional humanists in our history department, English, my own department of religion studies, and others I'm forgetting. Students love the humanities, frankly. They just don't get here quickly because they come in for other things and they finally have room to fill their humanities requirement junior year, maybe. So they don't discover what's here. And I think there are many pragmatic ways you could reach out to do this. Several years ago, a number of folks led by the Humanities Center sat down with Provost Urban, and we suggested things like having, dedicated merit scholarships for strong humanities students. There's lots of things you could do. My own career exists because of essentially a humanities scholarship. So there's lots of things you could do to bring in some of those top students who are really interested in this. I think the problem with our branding as makers and doers is that humanities work requires a little bit of room for explanation. The product, the object may be a long time coming, and our current cycles of how we promote things and how we recruit don't have space for that. Right. So that's another pragmatic thought. But I think we already have a lot here, and with a little bit more investment, you could make us a more well-rounded university in how we're perceived.
So Dina has her hand up, and then Siva.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to echo what Hartley and Jody said, but I want to be specific about what's going on in admissions/marketing. I mean, I think the problem is that even when we humanities faculty show up at various, meet the families kind of thing, where seniors and juniors in high school are coming, it's already kind of too late. We hang out and people don't come and talk to us. Why? Because those people, somehow the admissions office is not getting the word out that humanities at Lehigh are extraordinarily strong, a wonderful place for students, small classes, great interactions with professors. They're not getting that. And I served for a year recently on the newly reconstituted admissions committee. I think it's the only time in my life I've quit a committee before the end of my term. It was so pointless and so frustrating. And nobody in admissions had the faintest interest in talking to us. And my hypothesis is they make their numbers, which is their goal. They make their numbers by kind of doing, the lazy thing, right? Lehigh has a brand, makers and doers. Let's get out there and push STEM and we'll make our numbers for CAS anyway. And I'm not sure, Nathan, if anyone ever looks, I'm sure you look at things like gender and racial diversity, if only because US News counts that. But does anyone look at, this is not a rhetorical question, does anyone look and say, oh, thank you, admissions people, you made your benchmark, thank you. How many humanities, how many social science, how many, I don't know, but my guess is that probably the answer is no, and there's no motivation for them to bring in a more intellectually diversified class, because I guess it's more work.
Yeah. So I'm not aware of any effort to try and look, quite frankly, at any university at the sort of distribution of majors at that level. But I do think that it is something, if we're not effectively recruiting students in certain disciplines, in certain areas where we have strength, I think that's certainly something, that's an issue that we should address. So there's a question in the chat from William around this idea. I mean, okay, we talked about sort of makers and doers as a phrase that has a pretty strongly pragmatic sense to it. I'm curious, along the lines of what William suggested, are there ways perhaps of reframing that would broaden the conception that we might be looking for, that would bring in some of these other areas of strength? I mean, the term creator there is one that to me also, it suggests areas certainly of the visual and performing arts. Are there other ways of reframing this idea that captures some of the historic strengths, but also perhaps elevates some of these other ideas?
Can I start?
Sure, Stephen.
Yeah, no, so I think in marketing these days, one of the concepts that is coming up is what is called a service dominant logic. Primarily the value from any product, even a physical product, the value is ultimately intangible. I think that discussion actually can frame some of the discussion that we are having right now here. A car is a physical product, but actually the use of the car is intangible, taking you from one place to the other. A poem or a printed book could be something physical, but the value that is obtained is actually something intangible. So I think the whole discussion that we are having about humanities, the moment we go away from from the physical manifestation of things to what is the underlying value that is being offering, then we will be in a much more comfortable place. So a poet or a religious scholar or an artist or a maker or a manufacturer can all provide value, because all value is ultimately intangible.
It seems to me that I really like that idea of getting to the question of what's the underlying value of in this case, of the degree, of the major, et cetera, because I think that raises a host of interesting questions. My sense is that from previous institutions is that students, in part because of their parents and other sort of family considerations, often are initially reluctant to major in fields where there's concern, most on the part of their parents, about this sort of economic sort of return on investment of that degree, of the classic question of what you're going to do with that degree. And I think that reframing that to talk about both to note that degrees in the humanities actually in the long term are not less economically beneficial, and to talk about other values that one gets from engaging, whether it's in a major or a minor or just simply coursework in the humanities. So I think that that is something that we want to look at the way we talk about it, the way that we reframe it, and what our students and to some extent their parents say about that, which I think is important. I am told Philippe had a hand up.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So first, a disclaimer. I just got here like this semester, so I know nothing. I'm here to learn. I just wanted to share just the one story and maybe some another related idea. So when I happen to have a lot of friends in the engineering school at CMU, and when they learned that I was coming to Lehigh, they were like, wow, Lehigh is a really good engineering school and material science and so on. And all of my friends from the humanities, they knew that Lehigh was a really good school, but they didn't have that same, like, wow, the humanities is really good. It was more like a broad sense about the quality of the university. So of course, most of you probably know this, but it's just a recent story that I'd like to share. And to the provost's last point, there's been actually some recent research on the economic side. So I'm economics, talking about the value of a more flexible kind of education. So the marketplace or the industrial processes or the technologies have been changing so fast that the returns to say specific technical knowledge are not as high as it used to be compared to a more flexible kind of education. Of course, there's a whole spectrum of these things, but given the pace of change in the recent decades, it seems like returns to a more flexible kind of education or degrees like this have gone up relative to more specific areas. That's it. Back to learning now.
All right. So in the intro, well, let's take one more question from Henry or Oni, and then we'll move on to the next question from.
This is not a question. I'm only back from international relations. Frank and I probably have been here the longest, maybe, or at least have known each other for the longest. Let me give some historical perspective. When I came here a very long time ago, we really had a problem in the social sciences and the humanities. I mean, we didn't really exist. I mean, we were overshadowed by engineering and to a lesser extent business. But things have changed. Things have changed in the sense that I've seen an enormous improvement in the quality of our students. At least our students have done, in the last decade or so, have done exceedingly well. And so there is progress. I mean, and I think what we need to understand that, yes, it's been very slow progress, but it can be fastened, and we can work more on it. To me, it seems to me that the one thing we need to think a little bit more holistically, and that universities, although that may be difficult for maybe engineering folks to buy into, it's really about liberal education. It's really about learning how to think. And it doesn't matter what you do, provided you learn how to think. And for that, you need to be able to take courses across disciplines and across colleges. And we need to figure out this, shall we say, relationship between the different colleges for the students themselves in a more productive way. There's a way in which I'm biased, and I think engineering students should take classes from social sciences and humanities, and not necessarily vice versa. But nonetheless, progress has happened, and I think by hiring better faculty, by really pushing our students, by a lot of students from Lehigh in the social science and humanities have done exceedingly well, and we need to be able to bring them back onto campus and show them as role models. And that will also eventually enhance the university's reputation. And maybe get rid of this. It's only an engineering school, folks.
Thank you. So let's move on to the next question, which is from Beth Dolan.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. So I'm going to shift us a little bit to thinking about graduate education. So in response to our question that we asked when you registered, what do you envision for Lehigh in 10 years? Several of you urged Lehigh to prioritize graduate education. So if we were to prioritize graduate education, what would our doctoral programs look like in 10 years is the question. What would be distinctive about them? Or what would our professional master's programs look like in 10 years? And what would be distinctive about them? So what would you want to see change over those 10 years is another way of thinking about it. What could we do with our doctoral or master's, professional master's programs to prioritize them? Shiva?
Yeah, I think in general, I think if we want to go for a more of a broader perspective, typically PhD programs are the ones that take more and more a narrow perspective, right? Mm-hmm. So it is when you do even undergraduate degrees in business degree, we say 50% is from arts and sciences. But the moment you go into PhD program, it is so narrow. So this is where I think probably challenge is much more at the discipline level. For example, will a marketing program will be able to take somebody from history PhD, for example, trained in marketing? There are some bridge programs that I see in some of the academic institutions, but still doctorate programs by definition are so narrow focused that is probably going to be the most challenge if we want to achieve our goal of broad-based reputation for Lehigh.
Okay, thank you. So there's a comment also in the chat from Joshua Pepper. Will you say more about that? I love this point. Joshua, do you mind talking a little bit about your
Sure. I mean, this is of course an issue of resources, and that's much a broader conversation. But one of the challenges that we have, especially in both attracting students and educating them, is keeping them, is demonstrating our commitment to them. And one of the ways that other universities often demonstrate their commitment to their grad students is offering these kinds of multi-year fellowships, not just like 1 year, but 2, 3, I don't know about 4 years, but but multi-year fellowships that allow grad students not have to worry about being a TA, GA, or RA for a semester, but really plan a long time horizon for their own research to develop larger, more comprehensive projects. Many other universities offer them. I don't know what fraction or number those are, but those are things that when we talk about recruiting grad students, they often ask about. And one other thing that I think we could also do is provide more both departmental and institutional support across the university for incoming grad students to apply for external fellowships. That right now I think is very much just simply dependent on a particular department and advisor in terms of their level of encouragement and push. I think that's something that we as an institution could embrace a little bit more.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I agree with that. Other thoughts on graduate education and what we could imagine for graduate education in 10 years?
Rudy has his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Rudy.
Hey, Beth, thank you. And I myself, I'm from the business world and spent most of my career there. And I'm really motivated in the Master of Practice program. And I think there are some telling signs that show that where we need to be headed towards. I think we should be more distance learning friendly. We should be much more diverse in our options for remote learning. I think there are opportunities as well as pitfalls in that direction. The opportunities, of course, is you widen your base. We could have students located elsewhere, not just Bethlehem. And the minuses are we need to be able to develop those capabilities. You know, I think it's likely that we may not be very receptive to that idea, but the market direction seems to show that, at least in this area of graduate studies for professional practice. So I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Rudy. So we have some comments in the chat. There are a couple of follow-ups on Josh's point about fellowships from folks in humanities. So Jody says the lack of funding for a graduate program she directed, which I believe was American Studies, made it impossible to form a cohort. There's only one fellowship. Bill Bowman says what Josh said certainly applies to the PhD program in history. They can't compete with current funding levels. And then to sort of take us in a different direction, Henri says he thinks we should rethink graduate programs and maybe eliminate some or many of them. Henri, is that something you want to expand on in terms of how we would make those decisions to contract rather than, expand our graduate offerings?
Yeah, there is this temptation of starting graduate programs because somehow graduate programs make us, or a department or a program, look much better both in university and outside. And I would really disagree with that. I mean, that has been my department's position for a very long time, some of you may know, because even though we think we're a good department, we have resisted pressures to create a master's program because look where we are geographically. We're competing with Columbia, Princeton, Penn, just to name a few. And if you don't have the resources and really serious resources that you're going to put into a program, what's the point of bringing students to Lehigh in many of the fields? I'm not trying to say that this program or that program is not adequate. It's just that it takes away from undergraduate teaching, and I think has been recently our strength in undergraduate teaching, at least in the social sciences and humanities. And I think that's where we should put our effort. If you think history should have a graduate program, then yes, put a lot of money into that program and then attract students, but don't have a graduate program in history and one in political science and one in IR and one, I don't know, in all these different fields that will cannibalize from each other, right? Just focus. And then for the other departments, the fact that they don't have a graduate program doesn't make them less important or less and they still have they can be very, very good departments that are known nationally and internationally. But you're also giving the faculty more leeway to do research and also focus on undergraduate teaching. That's it.
So maybe we can take two more questions and then move on. There's one, and so Josh has his hand raised, and then Jenna Lay posted something in the chat. And Jenna, would you be willing to voice your point? I think it's an important point and something we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I think if we are going to talk about expanding graduate programs or strengthening graduate programs, we need to be really thoughtful about the moment that we're in and the moment that we're likely to be in 10 years, right? We have already seen academic hiring change a lot over the past 10 years. Certainly I'm most familiar with the humanities, but that field has contracted really dramatically. That is only increased as a result of the pandemic. And we're also facing increasing numbers of academic institutions that have closed and likely will close in the coming years. There are people who had tenure who are now searching for new academic jobs. And I think we need to recognize and acknowledge that and develop graduate programs if that is where we want to put our energy. And I certainly like that idea. We need to develop graduate programs that are adaptable, that are flexible, and that prepare our students for a wide range of possibilities, even while we help them learn about specific disciplines in which they are gaining expertise.
Thank you very much. So Josh, did you have your hand up again?
Yeah, let me just
final comment here.
Yeah, let me just make, so, I mean, I agree with everything Jenna said. It's absolutely right. And then to echo what Henri said, I think this is absolutely right, that there's a lot of times a lack of focus when we as an institution try to pursue some goal. And although I don't know if Lehigh is exactly known for always seeking consensus, a lot of times our major initiatives tend to be so spread out and diluted across so many separate priorities, areas, and fields that the impact is highly diluted. And I don't know what a better solution would be in terms of getting better focus, but we might need to make hard choices. And I think the value of our work and our initiatives is greatest when it's concentrated and really focused in specific areas. And I think that's something we should think about.
Thank you so much. So I think we're going to move on to the next question from Jennifer.
Oh, sorry there, I was on mute. How do we determine which areas of strength deserve investment? And I want to think less about naming a specific area than what would this process look like? Are there good models of this at other universities, for example? People have talked in their questions about we need to build on our strengths if we can't do everything. How would you figure out where to choose those areas? Frank, I'm lowering your hand because I know it was from a previous question and I want to give some people a moment to think and then can turn to this one.
What are some characteristics or some criteria that we should be considering for making decisions about these kinds of investments? Stephen?
Then, yeah, this is the time to think about why do we want to do this? So if we are talking about impact, I'm using impact, the loose term, it could be defined differently, but anything that can create or maximize impact, that could be one way to think about. Now, first we have to define what impact we want to make on the society. And then we have every program that we are advocating or supporting or funding should be able to justify how is it creating an impact. And whichever program creates more impact, programs create more impact, they should be supported. That could be one way to think about this.
People's thoughts about that, or thoughts about what would characterize the kind of impact that we're trying to achieve? I mean, as a straw man, impact may be, impact on rankings or reputation. Impact could be being able to influence funding, philanthropy. But what kind of impact? Sort of the success of our graduates. What kinds of impact do you think we should prioritize?
Josh, did you have your hand was up? Sorry, I was muted when I called on you.
That's fine. I mean, there's many different ways, of course, we can measure impact, including all those things that Nathan mentioned and more. But I think the difficult question we have to ask ourselves is the goal to devote more resources towards those areas that already are having the strongest impact or have a demonstrated ability to increase their impact in some particular way? Or is the idea to raise up the areas that we are, that are having less impact? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think that's a key question we need to ask before we pursue this kind of question, because everyone thinks about this in very different terms.
Now this is what I think we should focus on, the slope rather than where we are. Even if a program is already highly supported and funded, if it has got a good potential, its slope is very steep, we should still support them. Similarly, if a program is not doing well, but there is no scope, then we should not be supporting that, even though the program is not funded correctly. I think the slope is the criteria, not the level.
Thoughts about that?
Jody has a hand up.
So I put this in the chat, but I really think that when you're thinking about impact, obviously you can look at research impact, right? You know, how well is someone's research known? But I think if you want to talk about our students, then you want to think about what is really affecting them years down the line, right? What makes students write back to their professors and say, hey, I remember that book we read during this difficult pandemic time. I've been turning back to that, right? Because whether you want to talk about successful students who do well in the world, or you want to talk about students, you know, frankly, who think of Lehigh fondly and want to donate, either way, it's going to be those courses that move them emotionally, right? Those, as was said before, intangibles that I think you really have to think about. And, you know, I'm obviously biased towards thinking, as my colleague Hartley said in the chat, that we should be a well-rounded university, and that means investing across the board, making sure we're well known in, you know, we can't be great at everything, but in more things. I think that's a good idea, but I really want us to think about, you know, what makes students look back and say, wow, that class I took 20 years ago made me a different person, that transformation.
So it's actually interesting. There are a number of, probably about 25 institutions across the country that partnered with Gallup, the polling organization, to ask alumni at different stages post degree what kinds of things they identified as being important aspects of the university experience. And a lot of it had to do with experiential learning of different kinds. I mean, it's like working on a project that lasted for more than a semester, having a faculty member that essentially cared about that student as a person and that student's success. Gallup refers to them as the big five, 5 characteristics that, at least in a student's recollection, which is all that they can really assess, were things that were important to their university experience and that are correlated with their career success, their personal success, their sort of personal satisfaction, with a whole bunch of characteristics that are sort of positively identified by the students. And I think it is a really important thing to look at. What are the things that we do? What are the ways in which we engage with students that have this long-term impact? And then what are the characteristics of the university? Because I think another thing that clearly has a long-term impact on students is the overall success or reputation or vitality of their alma mater in a number of ways. And I think that is something that alumni look to and identify as important as well. Yeah, and so it's the question of, are we as an institution gathering this kind of information? To my knowledge, we're not doing, we're doing some surveys of alumni or whatever. This Gallup data, as I said, is from a bunch of different institutions. It started at Purdue, but it's sort of a pretty wide range of institutions that have participated in this survey going forward. And I think that there are some common threads to that, but it would be very interesting to know about people's the experience and sentiment of Lehigh's own alumni. And essentially, yes, to I guess Hartley's point, a lot of this I think happens best when we can create some opportunities for students to engage with faculty in smaller groups, whether that's a small class or whether that's a project. And so that is something that I think is characteristic and can be more readily done university with a 10-to-1 or so faculty to student to faculty ratio like we have.
I want to add one footnote to what Nathan was saying about, again, coming from the services literature. Impact can be measured both in terms of process and outcome. So I think some of the examples that we were discussing right now, some of them are related to the process of whether people feel encouraged, people be motivated, and some of them have to do with outcome and what do they go on to achieve in their life. Both of them are important in terms of impact.
other thoughts on this question? Again, the original question was, what might be a process or an approach to identifying areas for investment? And so we certainly talked about some as it relates to students and student experience and student outcomes. I'm also thinking, are there other metrics or other directions that we want to take, or other characteristics that we want to try and identify that where we want to have impact? So Jenna, I like your point there. You willing to elaborate on that a bit?
Sure. I mean, I think we need to be thinking about purpose and contribution, right? The students that we are teaching now are going to face challenges unlike anything we have faced. They're going to be facing increasing climate crisis, increasing issues related to that climate crisis, like large-scale migration. They will need tools and skill sets that are likely, in some cases, long-standing tools and skill sets, right? And I'm thinking of skill sets drawn from the humanities, drawn from the social sciences, right? Ways of understanding the world and their place in it. They will need to be able to adapt and be resilient. They will also need to find solutions to problems that we have not found solutions to. And I think thinking more about how we can help our students inculcate that resiliency, that adaptability, what we can help give them during their time at Lehigh that will enable them to help make the world a better place, to help address some of these issues. I think that's really crucial.
So I'm curious if people think that, again, there's no such thing as a typical student, but I'll use the phrase. Do Lehigh students typically come to the university with a purpose, a mission, not just to get a degree or just to get good grades or whatever, but with some broader sense of what, how they see their life going? And if not, is that something that we in any way try to instill or create? I really like this idea of students having a sense of purpose, because I think if we can instill that in them, then they will, we can give them skills and we can give them sort of characteristics throughout their education, but I really think a sense of purpose and an ability to define and sort of redefine their purpose over their life is something that would be something we should aspire to do.
But Nathan, sometimes our students, part of our job could be to develop their process so that they can find their own purpose. Many of them may not know their purpose, right? That is why they probably undergraduate. Graduates is a very different situation, but for undergraduates, they may not know. So it is our job to let them learn what the purpose is.
Yeah, and give them the tools to sort of define and redefine and redefine that sense of purpose over the lifetime. I think many people, this is a serial process where you identify something that is your mission, your purpose for a certain period of time. Then things change, conditions change, the world changes, and you may refocus where you're thinking. And I think that's a skill for people to develop. Intentionality, that's another good concept for this. And I think that in some ways, this is achieved by exposing students to some of the issues, some of the problems, some of the sort of topics that they might be attracted to, where they might find that purpose. Because I think the typical 18-year-old has an understanding of somewhat narrow range of topics and issues in terms of exposure. At least when I was 18, my level of knowledge, I ended up majoring in something that I didn't know existed when I was in high school. It's just not something that I think is typical of an 18-year-old.
I think this is where I sometimes go against, I'm a marketing professor, so I go against that, because sometimes we would go on popularity, which courses are popular, therefore we should offer. Sometimes we should offer courses that need to be offered. It may not be popular today, but that is, so we have to go against the marketing principle sometimes.
Right. Well, I would argue, I mean, to use another business analogy, if there was a market survey before the iPod came out, it would never have been created.
Exactly. Exactly.
Apple, Steve Jobs created the market for the iPod,
Exactly.
rather than identifying in a market that existed. There were plenty of MP3 players out there that were doing the same, roughly the same thing. And I think that I think that it's really important for universities to be have this role of creating, if you will, demand, creating a market for some of the things that we do, because of the fact that the typical 18-year-old has a pretty limited understanding of what economics is. Even a topic that is relatively sort of, in some senses, relatively common. Everyone sort of knows what an economist is, but I think the typical 18-year-old doesn't really know what economics is as it's practiced, and might not understand how quantitative economics can be, for just as one example. And I think that we need to be aware of that, and we need to be talking about that. And it's harder even in fields that where people have less familiarity. All right, I am getting a note that there's about 7 minutes left, and so this has been a great discussion. I'm going to try very imperfectly summarize some of the things that I heard, but first, before doing that, I just want to express my thanks, my gratitude to everybody here for the conversation and for the comments. And if you have additional thoughts about this, feel free to send them to me. I will try to respond to all, but if I don't, I'll apologize in advance. And if you want to, I'll try and reply to as many as possible. So I took notes here. I'm just looking over my notes and to try and summarize. So back to the question of what makes Lehigh Lehigh. I would say that, and this is in no particular order, and it's some things that I think we will embrace, and other things that we may not embrace. Let's just say. At the level of students, it seems like we have. Well, I would say pragmatism is an important thread of what we've heard. Again, for better or for worse. Lehigh is a place that, both in terms of the students, the kind of research that is often done, has a certain pragmatic bent to it. And maybe we want to recognize or embrace or elevate the idea that that there are some things where the purpose or the pragmatic outcome is not particularly obvious in the beginning, but that are still worth doing. I would I'll use a set of examples from my own sort of field. I'm effectively a basic scientist in terms of my academic training. We study in some broad sense how the brain works, without much concern about, say, treating disease or doing anything of practical value other than sort of treating the brain like a cosmologist treats the universe, in terms of trying to understand something that's a complicated thing. Nonetheless, I think that often those fundamental discoveries, or those fundamental sort of approaches and analyses, have long-term consequences that are difficult to predict. And I would say that there can be a sort of a pragmatic view on that, even though they're in the short term, there's very little that's pragmatic about what it is that we do. And I think that perhaps we need to look at ways in which we can recognize and elevate some of the things that we do, which are at least not in the short term, don't have pragmatic value in the short term. I think that is something that is important, both for our thinking about the kind of research we do, and the approach that we take to education, because as someone noted, in many ways, in the current era with the way that the economy and sort of technology is changing things, in many cases, the pragmatic skills that people learn have a short half-life, and we want to make sure that there is investing in teaching students some of the broader skills, teaching students how to think critically, and how to engage in ways that go beyond the most pragmatic value. I mean, again, sort of another example that comes to mind is it's not about teaching students how to program in Python. It's about teaching students to think computationally. It's teaching a way of thinking rather than teaching only a skill. Often there's a skill that has to come with it, just as writing is a skill that has to come with and it's allows people to express the kind of thinking that they do, whether it's in humanities disciplines or generally. It does seem like there's some agreement about the students who come to Lehigh typically having this sort of pragmatic nature. Maybe it's in part our job to teach them about some of the broader values of this more somewhat less pragmatic approach, say. But that students are, I would argue that students are likely to embrace that if we present it in the right way and we sort of talk about it in a way that connects with them and with their experience. I think Siva sort of talked about this in terms of thinking about what we do at a somewhat higher level of abstraction that I thought was helpful. A lot of discussion about the humanities and the ways in which we can better market, for lack of a better word, but I think I feel like it's making the argument for the humanities. It's structuring an argument as to why it is that this is important, whether it's for students to major in or students to gain exposure to and experience in from a variety of different disciplines. I think in doing so, we will benefit students in a variety of different ways. Some questions about graduate programs about how we prioritize, whether we should create new ones, whether we should be more focused. I think there's an important set of questions there where clearly there's going to be some differences of viewpoint. I think one important point that it was Jenna who made, that whatever we do with respect to graduate programs, it has to reflect or recognize the nature of the current academic landscape. I mean, there are a bunch of places that have suspended admissions into whole sets of graduate programs this year, and maybe beyond. And in my view, I think it is very important that we look with respect to our graduate programs, our PhD programs, about the degree to which we are training students to be more than just academics, and to be prepared for, to use the skills and the education that we provide them outside of the academy, because I think in many fields this is becoming increasingly important. And then a lot of sort of questions about where we might invest, how those investments would achieve the greatest impact, whether that's, I guess Siva's term slope, or it was Jody's idea that you want, if you can make inexpensive investments and have a big impact, then maybe that's a good place to be. Discussion about the sense of purpose between what was said and then in the chat. Maybe there's some differences in definition of purpose. I would say purpose here to me does not just mean finding a job and having a good income. Purpose here could be sort of loftier goals. And with that, that's just a quick summary. Thanks everybody for the conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I learned a lot about people's perspectives and thoughts about Lehigh. And I think we're a bit out of time, so I wanted to just say thanks again, and we'll have another one of these in about a month. Topic to be determined, but look forward to engaging with you again and hoping that we get to engage in real life sooner rather than later. So, thanks.